welcome, friends. So glad to have you here on this beautiful Tuesday night. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Chelsea Baldwin. I work the youth ministry, what am I? Senior coordinator for youth ministry for the Archdiocese of Chicago. Sorry, it's been one of those kind of days. I do know what I do. And I'm excited to introduce my colleague, Clarissa Aljentera, who is, oh, I said that wrong. Anyway, she'll say her name correctly. And we are talking about understanding Catholic social teaching and our call for racial justice. So take it away, Clarissa.
Awesome. My name is Clarissa Aljentera, and I work in the Office of Lifelong Faith Formation in the Archdiocese of Chicago. My role is Ministry Support Coordinator, and in that function, I support teams like this team, the Youth and Young Adult, Youth Ministry team. For a while, it was called Youth and Young Adult, but now we're Youth Ministry. So, Youth Ministry team, the Marriage Prep Pre-Cana program, and supporting kind of just different efforts throughout our office. I've been in the Archdiocese since 2013, and I've held a variety of roles, including like media stuff, adult faith formation. I was doing marriage prep and pre-Cana for a while. And only recently really started to do work around racial justice. I am helping to co-lead some initiatives within the Archdiocese, both internally and externally. The Department for Parish Vitality and Mission will be doing some programming and some listening with representatives from our parish to start to think about, how we can really incorporate and do more around racial justice and in our different programs, youth ministry, religious ed formation, different types of lay ministry, liturgy, and also working to do stuff within our pastoral center. We've got a racial justice circle committee that is comprised of almost 24 employees across the pastoral center who are interested in leading the conversation around racial justice and what that could look like. And so I'm working with Bishop Perry and Cliff Barber on that. So in different ways, I've been engaged in some of this conversation around racial justice. So I'm glad you're here. We are going to do some PowerPoint slides. I'm going to hope to engage people through the chat. So don't wander too far away if you're like listening to this and, maybe doing dishes or getting ready to put a little one to bed. I've got some videos to integrate some media. And we're hoping to go about an hour. So if you have questions, I can't necessarily see the chat, but feel free to kind of chime in since we're a smaller group if there's something that you want me to stop or explain. And off we go. So our first thing is we are going to do an opening prayer, and this happens to be one of my favorite songs. And it is Lift Every Voice and Sing. Oops, let me redo that again. So I can get all the sounds, which will be important for this. There we go. I am hoping that you will jump in the chat box, introduce yourself, your name, the parish perhaps where you're coming from, or organization if you're not necessarily attached to a parish, just so I get a sense of who's here. Um, and I will, as you do that, I'll go ahead and move on to the goals and what we're going to be accomplishing in our time together. Don't be shy to type in all the things, all the fun, important things in the chat. Um, all right. Name and parish in chat, please, just so I get a sense of who's here. Um, a couple things that we're going to be doing today. Some of this is taking a deeper dive with Catholic social teaching and kind of understanding it and how it's tied to how we can work toward racial justice. We also briefly touch upon the 2008 document from the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, Open Wide Our Hearts, and how it informs our racial justice conversations. Um, and at the end of the talk, we're going to talk a little bit about an anti-racist framework that I've taken from Dr. Ibram Kendi as a way to continue this conversation for you, but also as a way to leave you in a way that you're thinking about, kind of where you want to go um, with it. So now that I've got you in the chat, I'm hoping that you can jump back in the chat again and share with us all, what drew you into this conversation around racial justice and Catholic social teaching. Is this topic something that is new to you? Is it something that you've always wanted to explore? Is it something that maybe someone passed on? If you would just kind of share that, so we have a sense of, what drew you into this conversation and why you're here. Uh, while you're doing that, I'll go ahead and just keep going. We'll talk a little bit about the history of Catholic social teaching, kind of what it is and how it came to be, and use that as our framework. The roots of Catholic social teaching are it's rooted in the Hebrew prophets and who announced God's special love for the poor and called God's people to a covenant of love and justice. Catholic social teaching is also built on a commitment to the poor. This commitment arises from our experiences of Christ in the Eucharist. And so we can kind of understand it from there. Uh, what I'm going to do is, and you'll see this throughout the talk, but I'm going to put both our Catholic social teaching doctrine right next to the most recent USCCB document, Open Wide Our Hearts. And you'll kind of see as we go through the conversation, different places in which Open Wide Our Hearts and Catholic social teaching kind of really work together. And if we understand how both can work together, that might help strengthen our framework for kind of understanding racial justice. But the first document, kind of from most recent order to the oldest, Open Wide Our Hearts, the Enduring Call to Love, was released in 2018. And in 2000, or I'm sorry, in 1979, we have the document Brothers and Sisters to Us, a pastoral letter on racism. In 2013, there's a 25th anniversary executive summary, Reconciled Through Christ. Um, and On Racial Harmony was produced in 1963, and it's a statement by the Administrative Board, National Catholic Welfare Conference, that reaffirms that the U.S. Catholic Bishops' official position against racism, discrimination, and segregation. Chelsea, before we move on, do you mind throwing the poll up for our folks? I've got a couple polls. This is the first of two polls. We'll see one at the beginning. We'll see one at the end. If you wouldn't mind answering it for us, just to give me a sense of where you're coming from, have you heard about the document USCCB Open Wide Our Hearts? If yes, click yes, and or no, that's fine too. The second question is, has your parish or organization hosted any conversations around racial justice or racism in the last year? Um, so while you are doing that, I will move on, and then Chelsea, will the chat just show us? Oh, yes, there it is. Okay, so most of us have heard about the document, and then some of us have had conversations around race and racism or racial justice, and some not. and then some haven't heard. Well, fantastic. Thank you so much for being here, stopping by, and learning more. I'm just giving a read through who is here. So we've got Sister Annie from Colby House Jail Ministry. Awesome. Gloria from Colby Jailhouse was here earlier in the earlier session, so I'm glad that you're also here. Uh, Deacon Allen, awesome. Thank you for joining us from Hoffman Estates. Um, Jack Rogers from St. Francis Xavier and Colby House, awesome. And then Chelsea, awesome, awesome. This such a great cross section of people involved and engaged in different types of parish work. All right, so here we go. All right, so I've got two definitions of racism. To frame this conversation, what I did was I read USCCB document Open Wide Our Hearts. It's available on the USCCB website. If you've not already seen it or read it, you can download a PDF and print it or read it online, whatever works for you. And the other book I have is Father Brian Massingale's book, Racial Justice in the Catholic Church. And he's actually got a chapter in his book on racial justice, chapter 2, that talks a little bit about Catholic social teaching. And if you're really interested kind of in Catholic social teaching and where the bishops have moved from since 1963, that's a really great place to kind of enter into the conversation alongside of the USCCB pastoral document. So I've got two definitions. One is from him in his book. He defines racism is not merely or primarily a sin of ignorance, but one of advantage and privilege. Uh, and the bishops define racism. Racism arises when either consciously or unconsciously, a person holds that his or her own race or ethnicity is superior, and therefore judges persons of races or ethnicities as inferior and unworthy of equal regard. So when we look at where racism turns up, most recently we have this image is taken from the US Capitol on January 6th. Recent symbols of hatred that we have heard about in Open Wide Our Hearts kind of illustrates this, images of swastikas in public places or nooses. And then we also get into the examples of systemic racism, things like redlining, healthcare disparities, employment, schools, and incarceration. And I'm going to share a quick video, like 3-minute video or 4-minute video on systemic racism to help frame our conversation.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, An investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
There we go. I noticed that we've got a couple people who are just joining the conversation. I don't know if you want to just put your name and your parish in the chat, or organization if you're not necessarily tied to a parish. And then also in the chat, you can see that, or if you want to go ahead and put in, what drew you to this talk? What about this topic was interesting to you on a Tuesday night? Was it Catholic social teaching? Was it racial justice? Was it both? The other thing I wanted to do is just take a moment. So I've got a couple documents. So I've got Open Wide Our Hearts from the bishops that we'll be using. And then also this is what Racial Justice and the Catholic Church by Brian Massengale looks like. Two really great texts if you're kind of engaged in this work. And then just because I see some people who are coming through this work from the Colby Jailhouse Ministry, a book that I just started reading this week, actually, and you might already have it, but Race and Restorative Justice, the little book of Race and Restorative Justice, Black Lives, Healing, and U.S. Social Transformation. I found it to be really helpful. They've got a really great chapter in here around healing. And if that's helpful in terms of how you're centering your work. So it's good to know who's here. It gives me a sense of, the work that you're all the good work that you're doing in your parishes. So off we go. Back to the share screen. Okay. So in the U.S. Bishops document, USCCB, Open Wide Our Hearts, one of the things that they're very clear in sharing with us is that racism is a pro-life issue. And that's kind of the approach they take in how to engage with this conversation and the ways in which they just storytell throughout the document. And I think if we enter this conversation around racism as a pro-life issue, it helps us to broaden our scope as Catholics and like how we want to engage others around this conversation. So our conversation is going to be grounded in Catholic social teaching and Open Wide Our Hearts. What you'll see on the slides is on the left-hand side, I outline Catholic social teaching, and I'll read a little bit more about that. And on the right side, I've got Open Wide Our Hearts in areas in which the document really talks about and illustrates, the different points that it makes for what we're talking about. So the first and like top principle of Catholic social teaching is life and dignity of the human person. The Catholic Church proclaims that human life is sacred and that the dignity of the human person is the foundation of a moral vision for society. This belief is the foundation of all the principles of our social teaching. We believe that every person is precious, that people are more important than things, and that the measure of every institution is whether it threatens or enhances the life and dignity of the human person. So in the document, Open Wide Our Hearts, we see that the bishops focus on the first chapter of Genesis, and we all know Genesis kind of is the beginning of life, our planet, our animals. Racism directly places brother and sister against each other. Just in terms of the examples we saw, talking about redlining and education, just different ways in which our society and our communities are working against each other instead of with each other. Oftentimes the connection between institutional racism and the continued erosion of the sanctity of life isn't something that's really clear. And I think that if we start to unpack what that really means and how we as a church can start to really draw ties between like how that works, that might really, help us understand, how to do some of this work. The next principle is called a family, community, and participation. The person is not only sacred, but also social. And so in the way this principle is set up, we belong to family. Our churches and our parishes are a community of different families. The communities where we live, communities where we work are, places where we're social, and the idea of participation and how we're kind of engaged in all of that. And so the bishops really say, when we're called to know the stories, we are called to listen and know the stories of our brothers and sisters. Many of our institutions still harbor, and too many of our laws still sanction practices that deny justice and equal access to certain groups of people. Certain group of people. So the document has 3 groups of people. It focuses on Native Americans, African Americans, and Hispanic Americans. In the section around Native Americans, there's a little bit in there about, how Native American communities were affected by colonization and what that looked like for them. Colonization and expansion and how that really hurt them, but also how that hurt has continued to kind of happen even, years and decades after the fact. The document also talks about white European immigrants and pioneers who acted in ways that were consistent with a sense of superiority and continued to uphold that mindset. Our third principle is rights and responsibilities. Every person has a fundamental right to life and a right to those things required for human decency. The Catholic tradition teaches that human dignity can be protected and a healthy community can be achieved only if human rights are protected and responsibilities are met. Therefore, every person has a fundamental right to life and a right to those things required for human decency. Corresponding to these rights are our duties and responsibilities to one another, to our families, and to larger society. When we think about rights and responsibilities, the bishop's document, Open Wide Our Hearts, really talks a little bit about, what happened even in recent times. So it goes like as far back as expansion and colonization with the Native American communities. It also talks a little bit about slavery. And most recently, it talks about, one of the things it highlights is the Flint water crisis and kind of what happened, lead pipes, communities that were, greatly affected, people who ignored the problem. And it talks about kind of, our call to help and serve in that community. The document also talks about the civil rights era and the changes that came about, but also the changes that we still have to continue moving toward. One of the things I found in some of this research that I thought was really interesting, especially if you're a Chicagoan, there's this report, Healthy Chicago 2025, that found that Black Chicagoans die almost 9 years sooner than white Chicagoans because of the systemic racism that is pervasive in many aspects of the community. So different ways that the document kind of outlines that were redlining, school closures, service reductions, over-policing, and predatory lending in ways that the community was greatly affected by systemic racism and continues to be. And so the hope in this report is that it was released in 2020. And from 2020 to 2025, what this organization is hoping to do is really work in certain areas to decrease that gap, right? Because 9 years really is truly a long time, and to kind of find that disparity in our city, it's hard for some of our neighbors in communities that have really been left out, neglected, etc. Um, the last example I have on this page is something that's recent and very personal to me. I belong to a parish on the south side, St. James on Wabash, that's actively been working with several community groups to kind of save Mercy Hospital. I think a number of us at the parish have recognized that equitable healthcare and good healthcare is a basic right to life issue. And so we've been working with a number of groups, probably the past 3 or 4 months, to try and bring some attention. The hospital declared bankruptcy. The hospital owners have recognized that it's been losing money over a number of years. And so only through like our faith, our Sunday community, have we really been able to work with others, but also kind of use that as an example of, if we as people of faith know that having good doctors and doctors that are available in the pandemic is clearly a need. That's something that we as people of faith want to work toward. When we talk about the option for the poor and vulnerable, a basic moral test is how our most vulnerable members are faring. In a society marred by deepening divisions between rich and poor, our tradition recalls the story of the Last Judgment and instructs us to put the needs of the poor and vulnerable first. So in the examples, I actually left the kind of same examples up. And, when we're talking about Flint water crisis, kind of the Healthy Chicago 2025 report, we're talking about Neighbors in Bronzeville, which is actually Mercy Hospital's a very close hospital to the Pastoral Center. When we're talking about, how do we work with those in our communities to make sure that they have, all that they need. The dignity of work and the rights of workers. The economy must serve people, not the other way around. Work is more than a way to make a living. It is a form of continuing participation in God's creation. If the dignity of work is to be protected, then the basic rights of workers must be respected. The right to productive work, to decent and fair wages, to the organization and joining of unions, to private property, and to economic initiative. When we look at Open Wide Our Hearts, we recognize that, after slavery ended, many former slaves faced continued servitude. In some cases, we've come to know that it was really just hard to even start a business. So if they wanted to start a small family farm, for example, how hard that was and how difficult. And so how hard it was for their family to kind of create a way in which would help the bread earners, earn that money and continue to support their family. The Hispanic experience has sometimes included discrimination as well. One of the things they point out is that there's discrimination in regards to housing, employment, healthcare, and education that have, brought more oppression to certain individuals in that community. And we can also look at the large income gap between Hispanic and European Americans as a persistence of certain discriminatory practices in employment and pay, as another example of, how that privilege looks. When we look at the principle solidarity, we understand that we are one human family, whatever our national, racial, ethnic, economic, and ideological differences. We are our brothers and sisters keepers, wherever they may be. Loving our neighbor has global dimensions in a shrinking world. At the core of the virtue of solidarity is the pursuit of justice and peace. Pope Paul VI taught us that if you want peace, work for justice, and the gospel calls us to be peacemakers. In Open Wide Our Hearts, we recognize that to walk humbly with God requires even more humility in the ways that kind of we're encountering people in different communities. And then to work at ending racism, we need to engage the world and encounter others. So, who is invited to our table that maybe doesn't look like us, isn't from our neighborhood, might not speak our language, what does that continue to look like? Care for God's creation. This is the last of the 7 principles. We show respect for the Creator by our stewardship of creation. Care for the earth is not just an Earth Day slogan, it is a requirement of our faith. We are called to protect people and the planet, living our faith in relationship with all of God's creation. This environmental challenge has fundamental moral and ethical dimensions that cannot be ignored. So I kind of leave the example of the Flint water crisis. In the document Open Wide Our Hearts, we look at policies toward Native American communities that led to the theft of their land. And then also in that same section, we read about the forced removal of the Cherokee people in the instances of the Trail of Tears and the Navajo people in the Long Walk. So what are some things that we need to think about as we're engaging in this conversation? And what would make sense to us? When we're working with with our young people in youth ministry or at the parish, or if you're working maybe in a high school setting, some of the basic pieces that some of these recommendations are taken from Open Wide Our Hearts. There's like a page kind of toward the end of the document that says, these are 15 things that you can think of doing. But some of it is learning our history, learning the history of people who look like we do, but also people who don't look like we do. And what does that mean? There's also an opportunity to learn about healing and reconciliation, especially in certain communities that have experienced oppression, continued oppression, and even the trauma that comes with certain communities and how that looks like for them. When we talk about finding resources, it's like, well, how do we find resources that are more inclusive? If we start to look at and gather all the materials and the webinars and all the flyers and books and stuff like that. The other thing is, if you're working in a multicultural parish, how do you engage volunteers and find catechists who are representative of your parish, so that way the parish body can see kind of who's there, but also the children or the teenagers understand that there are people that look like them in a leadership perspective, and how do we engage people in that way. Another idea is to create listening sessions for young people, to give them an opportunity to dialogue with each other on how they've encountered racism, either personally or within their families, and what that looks like. When we're talking about working toward racial justice, how do we center the experiences of Black, Indigenous people of color? What does that look like? What does that sound like in the context of our communities? A question I always like to ask is when we talk about who shows up in like our parish boundaries, right? Because we have come to understand that whoever is in our boundaries are the people we serve, whether they're in our pews or not. Who comes through our doors, but then who isn't coming through our doors? Is our community truly welcoming? Is our community truly inclusive? And how do we get people who don't look like? How do I get people who don't look like me, to continue coming? Who don't speak, who might not be English speaking? What does it look like to include them in our conversation, in our community? When we work to form relationships, who and how are we forming relationships with those that we avoid? And the document really talks a lot about, Open Wide Our Heart talks about that. How do we move beyond us to open our minds and hearts to experience other, to create those opportunities? Another piece that's important is to forge authentic relationships. I know some of us who work with young people know that young people really get a sense of like, that person's not being authentic, that person's really not being real, especially if you're an adult who doesn't know them that well. So how do we really come off as genuine and authentic in these times and in these relationships? The last piece is really thinking about, how does it look like to engage the adults at the parish or in the organization? I know some of us aren't at a parish, but how do we engage adults in this conversation to learn about how racism has impacted them? I know at the parish that I attend, we've been having these conversations around race for the past 6 or 7 months. And once a month we have these conversations, and it's really fascinating to hear from other people that I've been in community with for about 10 years, how racism has impacted them, and to really like truly listen. I remember after the first one, My husband and I are like really engaged in these conversations, and we never really miss one. I remember he said to me, he's like, if people really started talking about racism and just talking and just even just listening, like we would just come a little further than where we are today. And so like how to create opportunities for adults to be in conversation, but also how to deeply listen. So before I go on from here, Chelsea, do you mind throwing the poll up really quickly? I like doing polls, and so if you are just joining us, take the poll and then we'll look at it and then we'll continue on. And if you have any questions, type those in the chat after the poll comes up. So start to think about that if you have any. All right. I'm curious if anyone has any questions at this point, since we're at a good stopping point. If not, I will continue onward. Okay, so the last piece I have talks a little bit about the anti-racist framework that I've borrowed from Dr. Ibram Kendi. So when we're understanding, undertaking an anti-racist journey, this circle graphic comes from some of Dr. Kendi's work around how to be an anti-racist. So I'm borrowing it from there, but it's kind of divided into 3 categories. There's the fear zone, the learning zone, and the growth zone. So when we hear about the fear zone, it's kind of denying racism as a problem, avoiding hard questions, striving to be comfortable. I talk to others who look and think like me. And I think that as I've engaged in this work for a number of months, and so not a terribly long time, I think it's really understanding like that there's a great discomfort that goes along with this journey. And so much of that is okay. So much of that is kind of the authentic journey, is to understand like, I don't know what I don't know, and I have to unlearn from myself. The second sphere is learning zone. I recognize racism as a problem, as a present and current problem. I seek out questions that make me uncomfortable. I understand my own privilege in ignoring racism. I educate myself about race and structural racism. I am vulnerable about my own biases and knowledge gaps, and I listen to others who think and look differently than me. And the last place is the growth zone. Identify how I may unknowingly benefit from racism. I promote and advocate for policies and leaders that are anti-racist. I sit with my discomfort. I speak out when I see racism in action. I educate my peers how racism harms our profession. I don't let mistakes deter me from being better. I yield positions of power to those otherwise marginalized, and I surround myself with others who think and look differently than me. So that's kind of the whole of the conversation, and I'm kind of curious to hear from you all if you want to type in the chat, or if you want to come off chat and use your microphone. What is one thing you learned that you want to share with someone else? And where's one area you want to continue learning and growing? So the 2 questions are, what is one thing you learned that you want to share with someone else? And where's one area you want to continue growing and learning? I'll stop sharing and put us all in chat mode or in share mode. Does anyone have anything that they want to share that they learned that they want to share with someone else? Or where's one area you want to continue learning and growing? Okay. Well, I'm curious, Chelsea, are you able to show the results of the poll? Did I shut it down too quickly? Awesome. So 100% of the people want more resources on on racial justice. That's what we heard in the afternoon session. And would you be interested in an informal discussion group? It sounds like a couple people are like yes and maybe. Perfect. That's great. Chelsea put a question in the chat. Do you think the Catholic Church talks about racism enough, and does it depend on your parish? I will answer that, but I'm kind of curious if anyone else wants to, to jump in, just because I feel like if you came to this talk, you're somewhat interested in it. Maybe your church where you attend is talking about it or not talking about it. Derek, Jack, Deacon Allen, Annie.
This is Deacon Allen. So just so you know, the chat is disabled, so I'm not able to type in there.
Oh, shoot.
So everyone else might be having that same problem.
Thank you.
And to answer your question, no, we do not talk about it enough, if at all. And I think that's something I would like to discuss more in our parish. And as I said, I'm trying to kind of revitalize, refresh our social justice ministries. And this is, top of mind after what's been going on in the past, several months or several years lately.
Yeah. Chelsea, the chat looks like it's still disabled. Are you able to... is there a settings control or something? Does anyone else want to answer that? Do you think the Catholic Church talks enough about racism? Before I...
Sorry, I'm trying to figure out what I did. I didn't know I could do this.
Chelsea and I are both on Zoom
All right.
and facilitating this for you, but also we are people who are learning. Yes! Chat is on! So if you want to type in chat what you learned and what you want to share, or what is one place you want to continue growing. And if you want to answer the other question too, does it talk about it enough? Feel free to come off, turn your mic on. But I think in general, the big C, the big church, I don't think we talk about it enough either. I think that, in the past 6 months and the work that I've been doing in the Archdiocese, there's been a lot of question asking and like, why aren't we doing this? Or how do we engage people in this conversation? What can it look like? So we've got different spheres that are working collaboratively, but also separately. So we've got a group in the Office for Catholic Schools, anti-racism group that's been working all summer and the fall, and now winter around the topic. We have a group of people from parishes that are going to be gathering next week or 2 weeks from now. We've got a select group of representatives that around faith formation that are going to be coming to the table. And then just internally, the Pastoral Center is going to be doing some work, kind of deciding what we want that conversation to look like and moving forward. And I think it's taken a lot of time just to get here. It's taken 6 or 7 months, especially after, Cardinal Supich had a letter that came out immediately after George Floyd was killed. And so it's tough because it's like, it's not, and it's trying, but at the same time, for some of us, I'm sure the hope would be that it would be a little bit more expedient and, we could be actively talking in that way. The Chicago Health Inequities. Yes. It's called Healthy Chicago 2025. And it's beautiful and it's fantastic. It's got a lot of great graphics, and it also outlines the themes in which they want to explore as a way to dismantle systemic racism. But it's also very just fascinating, the work and the efforts that are kind of being put into place and what that could look like. What is the relationship between individual racism and systemic racism? I'm laughing because Chelsea's like in there peppering me with questions. What is the relationship between individual racism and systemic racism? I think in the video that we saw, we hear that it's not just one person. I think in individual racism, we look at both what Father Massingale says, and the bishops. Some of it's the systems that were in place long before all of us, I imagine, were born. And so how does that play into that? but also I think both in the definition that Father Brian gave and the bishops gave, there's a certain amount of privilege that is just associated with racism in everyday life, that I know sometimes, like I know for myself, I've only come to discover, as a woman of color, but also as someone who my son is biracial, and so like what does that conversation mean for us in this house, and so just in different ways understanding the many privileges that I have but also don't have, and so some of it's systemic in terms of like how it's affected different communities, but also like how I enter into that. So it's a really tricky dance. um yeah, no, Annie, I think that's great. It is a really, really tough topic to talk about, and it's hard to talk about it well, and it's hard to talk about it from a place of authenticity. The next question from Chelsea is, what about people who don't believe in systemic racism? That's hard, because I think that, in order to fix a problem, you have to know and admit that a problem exists. And I think that if people are struggling to kind of see systemic racism and a certain, um, through a certain lens, or kind of be open to accepting and understanding that, then it's difficult. And I think that's, some of our role as Catholics, and the way in which we enter this conversation is like, so much of our work and so much of our time is rooted in prayer. And so it's really praying to listen. But I also think that the bishops really take a really pastoral approach in that this is the good work of the anti-racism journey, and also racial justice, is really rooted in listening. And so, how are people even just listening, and how are they kind of coming to the table and hearing something different? And so hopefully, the idea and the opportunity to listen more greatly is something that people kind of hold on to and want to be part of. Another really great conversation, if you've not seen it, was this summer. The Office for Young Adult Engagement hosted a conversation with Bishop Perry and with Tanya Woods, I think her last name is, and they talked about racial justice and racism. And it was a wonderful, phenomenal talk. It aired on their Facebook page. It's the Young Adult Engagement Ministry in the Archdiocese of Chicago back in July. And Bishop Perry did a wonderful job just talking about, the history and kind of the why and the how. And so if you're looking for more just really great fodder, he's definitely someone to kind of look at. We will send resources after this, but if you're also interested, Fordham University last week hosted a conversation with Pew and Father Brian Massingale and Dr. Tia Noel Pratt. And in the conversation, they talked a little bit about, the frame was Black Catholics, Black churches, and talking a little bit about how the Black Catholic Church has come to be where it is, but also like why Black Catholics, choose to not stay within the Catholic Church, and how certain structures in the church have worked in a way that has, led them to kind of leave. And it's really fascinating. And if you jump on Google, they have a whole YouTube page, and I'm sure I think it's actually up as of last week. If we have no more questions or comments, I don't know if Jack or Derek wanted to jump in the chat and share anything, either one thing you learned or one thing that, you maybe want to share with someone else. While we do that, I will pull up a closing prayer that I pulled from the USCCB, and then we'll call it a night. Okay. The prayer is to overcome racism. So in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Mary, friend and mother to all, through your Son, God has found a way to unite himself to every human being, called to be one people, sisters and brothers to each other. We ask for your help in calling on your Son, seeking forgiveness for the times when we have failed to love and respect one another. We ask for your help in obtaining from your Son the grace we need to overcome the evil of racism and to build a just society. We ask for your help in following your Son so that prejudice and animosity will no longer infect our minds or hearts, but will be replaced with a love that respects the dignity of each person. Mother of the Church, the Spirit of your Son Jesus warms our hearts. pray for us. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, I'll hang out for a little bit. In the meantime, it's been really wonderful to be with you. I know in the next week or so, we're going to be sending out links. We'll have this, video kind of cleaned up, and we'll send out some links, and look forward to that, and looking forward to, seeing you all in other conversations. Have a good rest of your night.